The Volkswagen Transporter is one of the most iconic and popular vehicles ever, with production still ongoing 74 years after it began. Over 13 million transporters have been sold to date, and the popularity of the evergreen van seems to only be on the up, an impressive feat. So there's massive cause for celebration, but how did the Transporter begin its life, and how has it stayed relevant across the entirety of it? This is a story of nearly 3/4 of a century of the Volkswagen Transporter, from humble beginnings to one of the most loved and most influential vehicles of all time. As previously stated, the Transporter had a modest start to life. The story begins in post-war Germany, where the British had control over the Volkswagen factory, which had previously made Beetles before the war and vehicles for the German military during it. The first trace of a Transporter comes from a vehicle known as a Plattenwagen, meaning flat car in German, which was used to move parts and materials between factories. The driver sat at the rear over the engine. Ben Pon, a Dutchman who was involved in racing, winemaking, Olympic sports and later importing VWs, liked the Plattenwagen and wanted to import it into his home country, but was unable to. He does have an important role to play though, as he comes up with a design that began the premise for the Transporter. It had a large space for carrying things and was rear-engined, but unlike the Plattenwagen, the driver sat at the front. Alas, it was rejected, but it set the wheels in motion for the first Transporter. However, later that year, Heinz Nordhoff joined Volkswagen as Director General. He wanted to make a delivery van that was different to anything ever seen before. The first prototype was made in early 1949, was named the Type 29, though it was short-lived as the Beetle chassis it was built on was too weak to support it. Another prototype was made, and this time it was strong enough. The T1, as it's now known, would use a 25 horsepower flat-4 engine. In November 1949, the Transporter was first shown to the press, and Nordhoff announced that people carriers, pickups, and an ambulance would join the existing delivery van. A weight of 875 kilos and the ability to carry 850 meant the T1 had an almost 1-to-1 weight-to-load ratio. In February 1950, a small number of Transporters were delivered to important customers, while full-scale production began a month later. In May, the Kombi and microbus joined the range. The former could be used for deliveries or carrying people, whereas the microbus is considered the first people carrier. The following year, the deluxe microbus became available, featuring shiny trim, a full-length cam sunroof in most cases, and a full dashboard, when other models had just the important instruments behind the wheel. That year, Westphalia would begin their famous camper conversions, and an ambulance became an option from factory. In 1952, the pickup was launched, offering more storage at the rear, and it gave VW a lot of stress to rejig components to provide it. In 53, power rose to 30 horses, and 54 saw the 100,000th Transporter roll off the production line in Wolfsburg. In 1955, the Transporter will receive a myriad of slight changes, mainly the repositioning of some components, and all models received a dashboard. The following year, Transporters found a new home in Hanover, as the Wolfsburg plant couldn't cope with the demand for both the Beetle and the Type 2. The 13th of September 1956 also marked the production of the 200th T1. In 1958, the double cab pickup was launched, offering the same level of practicality as a single cab, just with more passenger space. The following year, total production hit 500,000. Some changes to the lineup would come as power rose to 34 horsepower in 1960, while the high roof delivery van in 1961 offered an even more practical option for businesses. The millionth Transporter was made in 1962, meaning it took VW just 12 years to hit the milestone, an impressive feat now, but even more so at the time. In 1963, power rose above 40 horsepower for the first time, with it reaching the dizzying heights of 44 during the first generation. Production ended in July 1967, with more than 1.83 million being made in 17.5 years. So it's fair to say the Transporter was a smash hit. The end of the T1 coincided with the arrival of the T2. The iconic split-screen design with the V-shape was replaced by the recognisable but slightly less iconic bay window design. The new model was longer, wider and taller, as well as more powerful with a 47 horsepower engine. Within 6 months of the T2 arriving, production of transporters surpassed 2 million, meaning VW had made around 170,000 from August to February. In 1969, the chassis received some strengthening in the form of stronger door frames and some chassis parts being stiffened. The following year, power would rise to 50 horsepower. In 71, the T2 was now available with a 65 horsepower engine, and that September, the 3 millionth transporter was made. 1972 saw a few changes to the T2. The floor was redesigned to make a front crumple zone, the bumpers were reinforced, and external steps were replaced by interior ones. A 3-speed automatic was also offered for the first time, primarily for the US market. A year later, power rose slightly to 68 horses. 1975 marked the introduction of a new engine, as the 2-litre from the Porsche 914 producing 70 horsepower became available. In 1979, production of the T2 in Germany ended after 12 years and probably around 2.5 million made, although I couldn't find an exact figure. It's important to distinguish that the T2 didn't completely end production in 1979, as it continued in Mexico and Brazil for decades, with production only ending in Brazil in 2013. The T3 went on sale in August 1979, was again stylistically quite different, but the formula remained the same, with an air-cooled engine at the rear and rear-wheel drive. This was unusual, as cars were becoming increasingly front-engined, front-wheel drive, and powered by water-cooled engines. The T3 was longer, wider, and heavier than the previous model, and used 1.6 and 2-litre engines, with 50 and 70 horsepower respectively. The T3 had larger disc brakes up front, with drums at the rear. The T3 had a much more luxurious specification, with power steering, aircon, and a central locking system, all of which was not available on previous models. The manual and automatic gearbox options remained. In 1981, the Transporter got its first water-cooled engine, a 4-cylinder, 50 horsepower diesel from the Golf. 1982 would see the widespread introduction of water cooling though, as two 1.9 boxer engines replaced the air-cooled petrols. Power rose to either 60 or 78 horsepower. Water-cooled models are easy to spot, as they have a second front grille due to the radiator which sits behind it. They were quieter and more economical than the previous engines, and most T3s you see featured in newer engines. Later down the line, a 70 horsepower turbo engine and a 110 horsepower 2.1 petrol were offered. Between all the engine malarkey, a new model had arrived. The luxury Caravelle was a 7-seater revealed in 1981, and from 83 all people carriers were given this name. The Caravelle Carrot launched also in 83 as a more luxurious model, and many variants got Carrot treatment, particularly in the US. In 1985, the production of Synchro models would begin. It was a permanent 4-wheel drive system which could transfer power from the rear to the front if traction was lost. It needed a new subframe to cope with this, and the 4-speed gearbox had an additional off-road gear. The same year, the Multivan was launched, was essentially a people carrier that could also be used as a camper van. 1990 saw the death of the T3 in most cases, although production of Synchro models ran until 1992, and in South Africa they were still produced up to 2002. Sales were in the ballpark of 1.5 million to 1.75 million. The T4 came the same year and spelled big change for the Transporter. It was front-wheel drive, front engined, and was launched with only air-cooled engines, all first for the range. Design-wise, there were some hints of T3 throughout, especially at the front, but it was far more modern than the previous model. From launch, there were 2 petrol engines and 2 diesels, with power ranging from 60 horsepower to 108. There were plenty of options as far as configurations go, with all the previous models returning, and a choice of short and long wheelbase, and the option of a high-top roof. Volkswagen also sold campervan versions, whereas previously they had only sold standard vans, which then had to be converted. Synchro 4-wheel drive was also available, but only with the larger engines. On the topic of engines, they were updated during the T4's life, with more power, and TDI engines arrived at the later end of the 90s, joining the PD engines. The biggest addition to the lineup, quite literally, was the 2.8 VR6. It offered 138 horsepower at launch, although at the turn of the century, this was upped to 201. The larger engine needed more space, and this gave birth to long nose models. This was only required on Caravelles and multivans, as no other models received the larger engine. VW would wrap up production of a T4 in 2003, 13 years after it began, putting it second in number of years produced behind the T1. It was another great success for Volkswagen, who was estimated to have sold 1.9 million of them. Production of the T5 began in the same year, and design-wise, it was modernised with a style of other contemporary models. It was more of an evolution rather than a revolution, like the previous 4 models, which all look dramatically different. The Transporter had many variants, with short and long wheelbases, as well as 3 different heights of rooflines. There were even more commercial variants available, and plenty were commissioned for the emergency services. The California was the first camper van built in-house by Volkswagen and had all the equipment needed for overnight stays within. The Sportline used a 172 horsepower TDI engine in combination with a 6-speed manual. It had lower suspension, larger wheels and a sportier design. On the engine front, there was a heavy emphasis on diesels, with only a 2 litre and 3.2 litre V6 if you wanted a petrol version. There were 4 diesels with power ranging from 83 horsepower to the 172 horsepower engine in the Sportline. The Transporter now offered 4-motion all-wheel drive and a Tiptronic 6-speed auto. In 2004, the 10 millionth Transporter was sold, a massive achievement for the brand and the Transporter range. In 2009, the T5 received a facelift. Visually, it moved in line with all other models and received new tech and engines from the VW parts bin. It was the first van of its size to get a dual clutch gearbox in the form of a 7-speed DSG. There was also blind spot monitoring, LED daytime running lights, and a touchscreen with navigation and a reversing camera. It was all changed in terms of engines. There was just one petrol, a 2 litre. The power from it was between 114 and 201 horsepower. PD engines were replaced by TDIs, with VW claiming they were 20% more efficient than the outgoing engines. Yet again, the only option was a 2 litre 4-cylinder, but power ranged from 83 horses up to 177. The T5 was received well, winning plenty of awards, although they petered out towards the end of its lifespan. Production ended in 2015. There aren't any definite sales figures, but I'd estimate them to be somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million. The T6 predictably replaced the T5, with production beginning in 2015. This is truly where the evolution rather than revolution is easy to see. The T6 uses a T5 platform, with most of the changes being cosmetic, both inside and out. Both the front and rear were updated, while the side profile is almost identical. However, inside there was a new screen, while the dash layout is very similar to the previous model. The engines were also very similar, but have been updated since launch to comply with new emissions regulations and have been moving towards petrol. The model variants seen before all remained, with the option of manual gearboxes and the DSG, as well as 4-motion remaining. The T6.1 brought much greater change from its predecessor, with new, modern styling and a fresher interior, using technology from the Golf and the Passat in the form of the infotainment screen and the digital driver's display. The ABT e-Transporter was an electric version of the T6.1 and had a 37.3 kilowatt-hour battery with 111 horsepower, although the range was disappointing at just 82 miles. Production of a Caravelle, a multivan, ended in 2022, but the Transporter remains in production. The T7 multivan was unveiled, replacing the previous multivan and Caravelle. It's no longer based on the Transporter platform, so I'll keep it brief, but it targets a more premium market, competing with the Mercedes V-Class, which seems wild to think about. Inside, the tech used is pretty similar to that of a T6.1 Transporter, but it's definitely more lush than the commercial van. Engine-wise, there's also a plug-in hybrid option. There's also going to be a California camper van variant of a T7 multivan. So what about the T7 Transporter? It's on the way, and VW has been revealing some sneak peeks, but the design is yet to be shown off fully. From the images released by Volkswagen, the front is clearly similar to the T6.1, while elements from other modern VW vans, like the ID Buzz and T7 multivan, can be seen. There will be plug-in hybrids, as well as EVs, the long wheelbase version. VW has said plenty about the overall design. When it's fully revealed, we'll be able to judge whether it actually includes details from a Transporter's heritage, or whether it's more of a PR cliche. It's supposed to be rugged but stylish, and the Panamericana trim, seen previously on Transporters and other VWs, will return. They've also just announced some features of the interior, such as a 12-inch driver's display and a 13-inch infotainment screen, as well as promising plenty of physical buttons. The handbrake lever has been removed, and plenty of storage is promised in an interior that is supposed to be practical, but also modern and stylish, like the exterior. It will be launched in the first quarter of 2025, but pre-sales have already begun in Europe, starting at €36,780, or just under £31,000 at the time of recording. That's the story of a transporter, the vehicle that has truly transcended time. The T1 now has iconic status, confirmed by the myriad of concepts celebrating it, culminating in the ID Buzz and a T7 multivan, and Transporter paying homage to it. The cultural relevance of a Transporter has possibly never been greater, with appreciation for generations that were previously looked over, like the T3 and T4, and newer models commanding higher prices for the recent van life movement. The Transporter still tops VW sales lists each year, even after 74 years in production. With over 13 million made, the Transporter has to be considered one of the most important vehicles of all time, and long may it continue.